Hello, everyone. We'll do another chapter of the dear old Briar Patch today. Had a couple days off. It's been kind of busy and hectic. So, first, hello to Jackson, Matthew. Hey, Matthew, up in Jackman. Marjorie and Emma, all here in Maine. To Malia and Lucas in Missouri. To Kai Ming and Ru Kai out in Washington State, way out west. To Hope here in Maine. Hi, Hope. To Dylan in Maine and Lucas in Maine. To our friends Leslie and Mary, way over in England. To Ezzy and Indy in Oklahoma. To Kayla here in Maine. To Sylvia, Macy, and Lillian in Maine. Hopper and Judson in Maine. Caden and Xander here in Maine. Evangeline and Isaac up in Rhode Island. To Mabel in the country of China. To Oliver, Madeline, and Wyatt out west. And hello to Alex up in Passadumkeag. Okay, hey everybody. So let's see. Chapter 4, Such is Love. There's a couple pictures. A bird on a tree limb. And let's see. Two birds and Peter Rabbit. Is that Peter Rabbit or Mrs. Peter? I think it's Peter. The stone wall in the background. And part of the green forest it looks like, and some fields. Maybe they're Farmer Brown's fields. And those who truly love, no trace of selfishness has any place. That's from old Mother Nature. Despite all that little Mrs. Peter could do, she couldn't keep Peter at home these lovely spring days. They were lovely even when it rained, and they were as exciting as they were lovely. Old friends were constantly arriving from the sunny south, and others waking from their long winter sleep. Peter simply couldn't sit still. His long heels constantly itched to be running about in the old pasture and the green forest, to be anywhere but keeping still in the old briar patch. This morning, Peter was resting them at the edge of the old orchard. It was very early. Right back of Peter was the old stone wall. See the old stone wall in back of him? Oh, where was I? With that so near, he felt as safe as if sitting at the edge of the old briar patch. He was trying to make up his mind whether to hurry home or to remain there for the day. Unexpectedly, the matter was decided for him by the coming of two old friends to a tree right in front of him. They were Yellow Wing the Flicker and Mrs. Yellow Wing. He no longer even thought of going home. Although he was out in plain sight and set up to attract their attention, neither of them saw Peter. They took no notice even when he thumped a couple times. You see, they had eyes for no one but each other. Ooh, and such actions. Peter thought he had seen a lot of spring foolishness, but he had seen nothing like what he was watching now. Mrs. Yellowwing was the first to reach the tree. She lighted on the trunk and at once moved around to the other side. Yellowwing was close behind and lighted right where she had. At once he began to play peekaboo with her. He would peep at her around one side of the tree, then dodge back and peep at her around the other side. All the time he was talking to her. Not near enough to hear clearly, Peter couldn't understand what he was saying. But the very tone of his voice told Peter that she was being coaxed. She pretended not to hear. She took no notice of Yellowwing. She flew down on the ground, pretended to hunt for ants. He flew down beside her. He spread his tail as widely as he could, so that each pointed feather was separated from the others, so as to show its bright yellow shaft. He lifted high his widely spread wings to display their lovely yellow linings. He twisted and turned and nodded and bowed. He swelled out his beautiful spotted breast with a handsome half collar of black above it. Mrs. Yellowwing took no notice. Anyway, she appeared not to. She flew up in the tree. Yellowwing followed. Just then, there was another arrival in the tree. This also was a flicker. He was the same size as Yellowwing and just as handsome. He lighted just to one side of Mrs. Yellowwing and at once began talking to her. He bowed and bowed most politely and did his best to show her what a handsome fellow he was. Yellowwing promptly flew to the other side of her and did his best to attract her attention. Down to the ground, right in front of Peter, flew Mrs. Yellowwing. Down flew the others, and each did his best to outdo the other in showing off. Such a performance! It seemed as if they tried to do everything but turn themselves inside out, and Peter suspected they would have done that had it been possible. It was the silliest performance I have ever seen, declared Peter to Mrs. Peter when he told her about it later. I hadn't dreamed that folks could be so silly. Sometimes silliness is very nice, said Mrs. Peter, somewhat wistfully, then added sharply, it wasn't silliness at all, Peter Rabbit. If it wasn't, what was it? Demanded Peter. It was love, and love is never silly. I wish I had been there to see it. How fortunate Mrs. Yellowwing was, replied Mrs. Peter. In what way was she fortunate? Peter wanted to know. In having two making love to her at the same time, said Mrs. Peter with a dreamy look in her soft eyes. Ha! Exclaimed Peter, looking at her with something like suspicion. Ha! Did they fight? Asked Mrs. Peter eagerly. No, they didn't fight, replied Peter somewhat grumpily, and hopped off to another part of the old briar patch. 2 days later, 2 days later, Mrs. Peter sat looking out across the green meadows toward the distant old orchard. Those soft eyes of her held that same dreamy look. I wonder how she settled it, she murmured. You wonder how who settled what? Asked Peter sleepily. He had been out all night. How Mrs. Yellowwing decided which of the two making love to her she really loved. You know you told me you saw them over in the old orchard. Perhaps she hasn't decided yet, replied Mrs. Peter. That was 2 days ago, so of course she has decided and settled the matter. It was a silly affair anyway, grunted Peter, and then he yawned. I wish I had seen it. I think it was lovely, not silly at all, declared Mrs. Peter. Abruptly, she sat up very straight, and her eyes began to sparkle. As I live, Peter Rabbit, they are coming right this way this very minute, and I don't believe it is settled, she exclaimed. How do you know it is them? What makes you think it isn't settled? Asked Peter. I know they are flickers by the way they fly, bounding up and down in the air, and something the way we rabbits bound over the ground when we are in a hurry. And there are 3 of them. Oh, Peter, I do hope they will stop here in the old briar patch, cried Mrs. Peter. She was right. In a couple of minutes, the 3 flickers arrived in the old briar patch. They were Mrs. Yellowwing, and his rival. They alighted in a small tree, but almost at once flew down on the ground right in front of Mrs. Peter. It is doubtful if they knew she was there. They were too much occupied with each other, too concerned with their own affairs to notice anyone or anything else. It is well for them that no enemy is about, thought Mrs. Peter as she watched. Then she saw just what Peter had seen over in the old orchard. Such a spreading and shoving off of tails and wings as there was for Mrs. Yellowwing's admiration. Such bowing and hopping about before her. Such coaxing and pouring out of love notes. And all the time Mrs. Yellowwing pretended to be too busy hunting for ants to give them so much as a look. She doesn't know her own mind, muttered Peter. Perhaps, agreed Mrs. Peter. Then she added, and perhaps she does, but is in no hurry to make it known. I wouldn't be if I were in her place. Peter gave her a sharp look. Do you mean that if another rabbit should come around here, you would look at him twice? He demanded. I might, said Mrs. Peter demurely. I'd fight him, cried Peter fiercely. I'd drive him off. I wish one were here right this very minute, interrupted little Mrs. Peter, and sighed. Before Peter could find his tongue to continue his threats of what he would do, Mrs. Yellowwing reached a decision, or made it known anyway. She hopped over beside Yellowwing. She turned to him and began to bow. Then Yellowwing quite outdid his previous efforts in what Peter called silly antics. Mrs. Yellowwing did the same things. It was something to see. The other flicker stood still for a minute watching them. Then he flew up in a tree, looked down at them for an instant, then took to his wings, bounding away through the air to the green forest. In a few minutes, Yellowwing and Mrs. Yellowwing, side by side, were bounding toward the old orchard. It is lovely to be in love, said little Mrs. Peter dreamily. Ha, said Peter. Then he reached over and gently nibbled at the edge of one of Mrs. Peter's long ears. And that's the end of chapter 4. Read another one, I hope, tomorrow. Okay, bye-bye, everybody.